Greetings, friend. It's time for Chapter 5, Price Controls and Quotas. With respect to our course, or to anyone watching if you want to join our course, this is the first of 4 chapters before the final exam in this course. We're going to basically examine policy. Our first third of the class was looking at kind of the tools of microeconomics. The middle third was looking at where these tools operate and looking at the various market structures that exist out in the real world. And then this last third, we're looking at policy. So we're going to focus first on when governments should certainly stay out of markets to conduct themselves efficiently. And then we're going to look at 3 chapters on when and how to intervene and regulate to improve welfare and efficiency. So this is when there are market failures or various reasons why a government would be involved in a market. We're going to look at when that is and if a government needs to get involved, how to do that to improve problems rather than to make them worse. So we're going to talk about taxes and the least bad taxes we can have, externalities, that is the side effects of economic transactions where people who are not involved in a market experience costs because of those transactions, and public goods, types of goods that markets generally don't do an efficient job at allocating. So first, today, we're going to talk about when not to intervene. We're going to talk about price controls and quantity controls and why they exist. This is essentially when a government or a regulator has authority to mess around on our y-axis where we have price and on our x-axis where we have quantity to try and alter market outcomes. So we've got price ceilings and price floors on our price axis and quotas on the x-axis. The general idea here, I'll foreshadow it heavily, is that if markets are working okay, it is definitely best for governments to leave them alone and let them operate, lest they reduce efficiency. Again, when we're going to measure efficiency and welfare, we're going to talk about total surplus analysis. We will look at consumer and producer surplus, and how they add together to generate total surplus, and see if these policies make that worse. Do we get the most total surplus we possibly can, or does policy make things less efficient? That is, does it generate deadweight loss? So, sometimes governments step into a market and intervene where things are more or less working in a competitive fashion. Sometimes this does because the government is desperate due to war or famine or a huge impending storm or public health emergency, or to protect the interests of a certain group. That is, if you have friends who are writing campaign checks, or you have an autocracy and you have the authority to help a certain group. Regardless, what we'll see is that this reduces efficiency in society. We will see if a market's working okay and the government involves itself in that market, total surplus will go down, deadweight loss will go up in its place. To do this, I like kind of an Occam's razor, keep it simple, stupid kind of approach. We're going to look at perfectly competitive markets. A monopolistically competitive market is probably more realistic, but we can make the same points simpler by modeling this using perfect competition. So we're going to look at a market that's operating efficiently, and then we're going to intervene so that we can understand why these interventions are inefficient and why, as members of society, we shouldn't be a party to them or support activities like this, lest they make us all worse off, or society worse off. So let's begin with price ceilings. A price ceiling is when a government or a regulator places an upper limit on prices. They place an upper limit on prices. When you think of the price ceiling, you think of our model of supply and demand of a competitive market. A price ceiling is basically a cap, and price can't go up above the ceiling. We're going to draw it. A lot of people confuse the price ceiling and the price floor because the ceiling is going to appear below equilibrium in terms of prices. So they'll want to call it floor just because it looks like it's on the bottom. But it is a ceiling above which prices cannot rise. So think of letting a helium balloon go and it hitting the ceiling. It stops there. That's what the price ceiling does. It puts a ceiling in place and price just can't go above it. When these are put in place, they're generally done so to protect consumers from high prices. At least that is the intention. And we will see what that does to consumers as we analyze this problem. So let's draw this. I'm first going to plot our competitive market on the left, and then on the right, I'm going to have us convert to a price ceiling. We're going to see it implemented and see what the problem does to us. So let's resize the screen here. Cool. And let's get to work. So as a refresher, let's start with our competitive market. We should be familiar with the competitive market by now. We've got price on our y-axis, quantity on our x-axis, and we've got our demand curve that's downward sloping, and our supply curve, let's make that a different color. And our supply curve that is upward sloping, blue. Let's label our work and say we're in equilibrium, so let's mark that as E, and say we've got a price and quantity. These are the efficient ones that we know about. Okay? Now where's our consumer surplus? Remember, it's the area below demand and above price. So this entire triangle here is consumer surplus, the net benefit to consumers from participating in the market. And then we have our producer surplus as the triangle below price and above supply. And we've got all these pairs of consumers and producers, remember, transacting, where consumers who are willing and able to pay a higher price than P get the good and are made better off because they only paid price P when they get a marginal benefit that's greater than or equal to the price they had to pay. And then we have all these firms who would sell for a cost that's less than or equal to the price. So they're getting all this this benefit from participating in the market because, why? Because when your cost is less than your price, you're being made better off. So you've got, all these firms doing well for themselves. Okay. Generating producer surplus. Now what I'm going to do is on the right, I'm going to call this price ceiling, and I'm going to replicate what I've done on the left to start. This way we'll get a full comparison of these two scenarios. Feel free to pause if you have to. Right, now let's say a government regulator says these prices are just too high. Our consumers need lower prices. We have to protect them against this market and its dangerously high prices or whatever. So what they'll do is say, okay, we're going to set some price, I'll call it price subscript ceiling, less than the market price. And when we do that, the laws of supply and demand kick in. So what we're basically doing is, you can draw it all the way across if you want, putting a ceiling in, like a drop ceiling, right into the market. It goes all the way across for any quantity. No matter how much is bought or sold, it cannot be at a price above P ceiling. So when the law of supply and demand kick in, we know what that is at this point, right? When price goes down, what happens to quantity demanded? You put in this price and you look at our model for demand, the quantity demanded is high. We'll call it QD high. When you cut that price, people will be clamoring for the good all of a sudden. Look at that. Look how low the price is. A bunch of people who were not willing and able to pay the market price are now going to say, I want it. Give it to me. Now, when I put in this price for firms, we know the law of supply tells us when price goes down, quantity supplied goes down. So we put this into our supply model here. I've got quantity supplied low. Well, what do we have happening here? How much is actually transacted in the market? Is it how much people want to buy? No, because it's restricted by how much firms are willing and able to produce. All these people can want the good, but all that's available is how much will be produced. So, when that's the case, what do we have? That is our classic shortage that we learned about, because quantity demanded exceeds quantity supplied. Okay, so what does that do in terms of efficiency for society? Well, it cuts off a lot of transactions. And when that happens, what do? All this area that was consumer surplus before is gone to deadweight loss. We lose these transactions. As we're trying to help consumers by offering them a low price, but what do we actually see? We see some consumers who could buy before now no longer can. So there's deadweight loss. Similarly, we're creating some deadweight loss for firms by knocking some of them out of the market when we enforce a lower price. Okay, well, this is gloomy, right? Well, there is one winner here. Where's my new producer surplus? It's only right below price and above supply. So it's just this triangle. Every firm's worse off. The only people who win are consumers who do get the good at the new lower price. Right? So our consumer surplus is below demand and above the price. So some consumers steal this rectangle away from producer surplus. Those consumers who are able to get the good now pay a lower price, get a higher share of consumer surplus. Some consumers are kicked out of the market. In fact, a bunch of consumers along the demand curve are standing around waiting in lines, not getting the good they want. And every firm is made worse off, unambiguously, because some are kicked out of the market, and those who stay lose producer surplus to some consumers. That is an inefficient policy right there. All right. Now, as a specific example, we're going to work on a government placing a cap on the price of gasoline. When it comes up that I do energy economics in random settings in life, people will say, well, why doesn't the government just make gas cheaper? So we're going to do that example right now. We're going to look at a supply and demand schedule. We're going to graph it and look at some clear numbers and calculate what the deadweight loss is when we do impose a price ceiling on gasoline. All right, everyone, we're back. I've got us a lovely table and a lovely graph started for us, and we're going to work through the whole thing. So I've got a table with a demand and supply schedule for us, so we can look at possible prices and the quantity demanded and quantity supplied at each. So the price, and then quantity demanded and quantity supplied in billions of gallons. And then I've plotted this for us with price, of course, on the y-axis and quantity in billions of gallons on the x-axis. So feel free to pause and copy that down, and then we'll start working through it. I'll assume you're pausing and unpausing. So let's plot demand, just as a constant reminder that we can never do this enough. When the price is 4, our quantity demanded will be 0. Law of demand says when price goes down, quantity demanded goes up. So we're going to go 351, 3 and 2, 253, 2, 4, 155, 1, 6, cents 7, and 0, 8. Let's connect our dots. As is tradition, label our demand curve, as always. Next, let's plot supply. So here we're going to kind of go from, our bottom to our top. The price of 0, our quantity supplied, let's say is none. And at 50 cents, let's say it's 1. At $1, it's 2. Our law of supply going strong as price goes up. So does quantity supplied. So at 150 it's 3. At 2, it's 4. Oh, I love when equilibrium's clearly happening. At 250 it's 5. At 3 it's 6. 350 it's 7. At 4 it's 8. So connecting those dots again. Cool. All right, I've got supply and demand here. And now let's put it in the equilibrium that it is. Well, we know our P star is 2. That'll be our equilibrium. And that will be our Q star at 4 billion gallons. So, all well and good. We've got our nice consumer and producer surplus triangles and total surplus being as big as it can be. Every possible mutually beneficial transaction is taking place. So society is at a competitive equilibrium. Things are swell. Now let's say, to be nice, some well-intended politician says, now there's a price ceiling. We are going to cap the price of gas at $1 a gallon. Now what's going to happen? Well, if we go to our table, anybody took Principles of Microeconomics, they'd know you can't do that without driving a wedge between consumers and producers. When we put in a price of 1, right, we've got some price ceiling. This is going to be a binding price ceiling. This is going to do something to us because now prices cannot rise above this ceiling of $1. Okay? What's going to happen? Well, the law of demand, when we put in a price of 1, tells us our quantity demanded is 6. And the law of supply tells us when we put in a price of 1, it's less than the equilibrium price, quantity supplied is going to go down. We've driven a wedge between quantity demanded and quantity supplied. And we have created a what? Exactly. That is a shortage. It's a 4 billion gallon of gas shortage because a lot of consumers want to buy it and firms, it's not worth it anymore. Not going to make it. So what does this do to consumer and producer surplus? Well, the short side of the market dictates how much is actually transacted. We're limited by how much these firms are willing and able to participate. So we're cutting off the market there. And we are taking some area out of consumer surplus as deadweight loss and producer surplus as deadweight loss. Every firm is hurt. Every firm is hurt. Why? Because the new producer surplus below price above supply is just this little triangle. Now, some consumers are locked out of the market where they used to be able to find gas. But if you can get it, now what? Now you are getting an extra $1 of consumer surplus each. So are there some winners here? Yeah, there are some individuals where if you get the gas, what you're doing is taking $1 each time you buy a gallon that was producer surplus and transferring it to consumer surplus. So consumer surplus loses some triangle deadweight loss and gains this rectangle from producers. At best, one would hope that this rectangle is bigger than this triangle. That is, you're overall at least making consumers better off than you made them worse off. But whatever we're doing, we're making society worse off because we're creating deadweight loss where there was none. We've created a mess where there didn't need to be. So how do we calculate that deadweight loss? Well, it's just the area of the triangle, 1/2 base times height. So how would we calculate that? We've got one side of the triangle is 4 billion minus 2 billion. And another side, that is 3 minus 1. And if you can't see that, put in that quantity of 2 into the demand function and see what the price would be there so that you can make sure you really get an understanding of where this is on our price axis. So I've got $3 minus $1. And so, what does that equal? I'll let you calculate it. That's right, it is $2 billion. So that would be a sizable loss to society in our, hypothetical example here of the damage done by this policy. So the consumers who do get gas are made better off, but a lot who want to participate in the market are not able to and are made worse off. So some consumers who wanted to participate can't, and there's going to be a bunch of people lined up trying to get gas who just can't find it. And all firms are made worse off. So what do these policies do to society? Well, we create deadweight loss. That's not good. We are now transacting an inefficiently low quantity, so less of the good is available to society. And we have an inefficient allocation to consumers. That is, we've induced a bunch of people who don't really need the good. That is, people who have a low willingness to pay for the good. They're now looking for the good. They might be the people who find it. So we might be making people who have a high willingness to pay not be able to get it. An example of this would be like rent-controlled buildings in a city, New York, San Francisco, where a local government will enforce lower prices than what the market would bear for housing. Now, what that does makes it so that a lot of people who would pay a high price are not able to find housing, while people who might not want it as much are able to. An example of this, someone who works in Florida, is the snowbird. Right? If you have rent controls and somebody is able to maintain a house in New York or an apartment in New York for a lower than market price, they might be able to live there for half a year and live in Florida for half the year. A lot of traffic, am I right? And people who, have just graduated or are looking for work in New York can't find housing because, there might be a shortage because of that. There's a lot of wasted resources involved, whether we're looking for housing or looking for gas, whatever it would be. When there's a shortage, you spend a lot of time and energy looking for the good. And there are opportunity costs to that in terms of you're not working, you're not using your capital and labor for an efficient purpose, for a productive purpose. So these can be incredibly wasteful. These also give an incentive to have a low quality good or service. So if you push the prices down, imagine you're the landlord of the rent-controlled building. If you could make $2,000 a month in rent, but you're forced to only accept $1,000, you probably are not going to make all the upgrades and all of the necessary maintenance that you would if the price was $2,000 instead. You might let that thing turn into a slum to an extent. So this can incentivize poor quality goods. And this also incentivizes black markets. If you can't find the good because there's a shortage, you may turn to some less than upright members of society, let's say, to find the good or service. So there's a lot of negatives here. How can these possibly exist in the world? Well, someone does benefit. That is, consumers who pay the low price and have the good. And that is, if you have a rent-controlled apartment, awesome. You don't have to spend that much money as you would in a purely market outcome. Those people know they're winning, and they tend to be very organized and loud and become much more influential than other people who are not benefiting. A lot of times people don't know that they are losing out because of these policies, or because it doesn't directly touch them in some way that they really know about. They don't really organize and get loud about it. So if you're going to lose your rent-controlled building, those people are going to band together and go to City Hall and be really loud about it and try to protect their interests. All right, let's talk about price floors. Okay. A price floor is a government or regulatory authority placing a lower limit on prices. These are generally put in place to try to protect sellers against low prices. So while the price ceiling is to benefit the consumer, the price floor is a similar idea, just now we are targeting protecting firms. Now this is a floor on which prices sit, below which prices cannot fall. So we're going to draw this, and it's going to be on the top of our model, so people often want to call it a ceiling, but it's like a floor. I'm sitting on one right now. Well, my chair's sitting on the floor technically, but you know what I mean. We have, I am sitting on this floor, and it's precluding me from falling onto the first floor of the College of Business. Thankfully for me. Maybe not for you watching this video, but for me. Okay. For a price floor to be binding, it has to be above the market price. What would happen if you tried to put a price floor in place below equilibrium? It would do nothing. It would just sit there. So if you're going to execute one of these policies, it has to be placed above the equilibrium price. Okay. Let me get the board ready. Time out. Okay, so let's do a graphical example of the price floor. On the left, I'm going to start with a competitive market again. And on the right, I will show a price floor being set as we look at our price controls. And we're going to see that this time we get a surplus, but it also creates deadweight loss. So we're going to have a loss in economic efficiency when we have a market intervention in a competitive market. So let's look at that and then examine how consumer and producer surplus are affected. So to begin, let's have our downward sloping demand curve and our upward sloping supply curve get us started. Okay. Let's have our competitive market be in equilibrium. So we know price and quantity. So if this market is working out all right and we're in a competitive situation, we know that consumer surplus and producer surplus are as big as possible. Total surplus is maximized, no inefficiency. Okay, this is our ideal scenario. Here it is. Now let's take that and create inefficiency through a misguided policy mechanism. So let's replicate our competitive market with our price and quantity and our consumer and producer surplus. Okay? Now let's watch what happens as the price floor is set. So now we have some government regulator saying something to the effect of, these prices are just too low. We have to protect our companies. Prices need to be higher. So what are we going to do? We need to find some price, and we'll call it price subscript floor. Okay? And that is, this is a price that we just can't go below. Price below which prices cannot fall. So what we do here is basically put a floor in place. So the prices have to fall and sit on this floor. What does this do for us? See, that says floor. What are we doing? We're just pushing up a price. Just pushing up a price. Below which prices cannot fall. What does the law of supply tell us about high prices? Okay, price goes up, quantity supplied goes up. So when we put in a price, we're going to get out a quantity supplied here that's high. That's very high. This is higher than equilibrium. And what about the law of demand? When prices go up, what happens to quantity demanded? It goes down. If we put in our price floor and go over to the demand curve, if you look at the behavior of our consumers, their psychology, they're seeing this high price, and what do they want? Not this. Right? So a lot of consumers go, nah. I'll call that QD low and quantity supplied high. We've driven apart the place, that special magical equilibrium place where quantity demanded equals quantity supplied. And now I've got quantity supplied high, lots of firms willing and able to produce at this artificially high price, and a lot of consumers going, I'm not in. They only have a small number of consumers who are willing and able to buy. So what actually gets transacted? Again, the short side of the market dictates what actually takes place. That is, it doesn't matter if people make a lot of stuff, only this amount, QDL, quantity demanded low, will be bought. Firms can pile up inventories all they want to. When the price is high, a smaller number of people will buy. So what are we doing? We are creating what's called the surplus. Whenever quantity supplied exceeds quantity demanded, we've got ourselves a surplus. Okay? Now what does that do to society? Well, we are having fewer transactions. That generates deadweight loss. So this area of consumer surplus is now lost into the ether, as is this area that was producer surplus. So right away, some consumers and some producers are being hurt by this policy. Where's my new consumer surplus? Well, below demand, above price. Below demand and above price is only that triangle. That's all we've got left. What happened? We've lost some deadweight loss, but we've also lost this rectangle because producer surplus is the area above supply and below the price. So what was consumer surplus has now been commandeered by the firms who do manage to sell at the new higher price. So for firms who can sell, they are made better off by this policy. They are the winners. But plenty of firms who'd like to be participating aren't able to move their merchandise. That's goods and services being offered and no takers. With respect to consumers, they're made worse off. Some consumers are chased out of the market, right? The new price is higher than what they're willing and able to pay. And those who will pay the high price from the origin to this point have a smaller surplus because part of theirs has been, again, transferred, is the polite way to say it, to producers. That's not what I call it if it happens to me, but transferred. It's one of those ways it's socially polite to say what's happening to you. All right. Next, we are going to apply this to a classic example of the minimum wage, and then we will discuss the efficiency and inefficiency of the minimum wage in different contexts. A lot of people are virulently against a minimum wage and for a minimum wage, and as an orthodox economist, I'm going to show when it's inefficient and when it's efficient. That is, scientifically, context matters, and there's not just one answer. So let's get that set up. All right, we're ready to go. Got a table of data here for us with a demand schedule and a price schedule for workers and, let's say, a competitive situation. So let's say we have price. We're going to call that the wage because that's what workers are going to get paid. If you put yourself in this situation as a worker, realize that the quantity demanded is for you. It's for what you generate for the firm. It's the reason they hire you. We'll call the demand here the marginal revenue product because firms hire you because of what you come into the table with your labor and human capital generate for them. That is, what additional revenue they get by hiring you. That's why they demand you. Then quantity supplied, that's you. You'd be the supply. So this is a little bit flipped because the company now is the demander and and the supply is now you. We've been thinking of ourselves in the opposite context so far this semester. So, let's plot it. Let's say we've got a wage of 10. Your coin demanded at the company for workers would be 0. If you put yourself again in this scenario, the demander is going to be a firm hiring you to work for them. So let's say at a price of 10, they hire nobody. If the price goes down to $9.50, they hire 2 workers. At 9, they hire 4. At $8.50, they hire 6. At 8, they hire 8. At $7.50, they hire 10. 7, they hire 12. At $6.50, they hire 14. And at 6, they hire 16. So let's plot demand. Yep. Now, again, this is flipped. If you put yourself in the shoes of the firm, they are renting your labor, right? You are the supplier. You are the person who shows up and says, yeah, I'd work for that wage, or no, I wouldn't. And so we're going to work from the bottom to the top as we plot supply, where at a price of 6, we're going to say, nobody will work. But as the price goes up, $6.50, 2 of you will be willing and able to get off the couch. At a price of 7, 4, price of $7.50, 6 will work. Price of 8, 8 will work. At $8.50, 10 will work. At 9, 12 will work. At $9.50, 14 will work. And at 10, 16 will work. So let's connect the dots and label that with S for supply. So in equilibrium here, quite clearly, quantity demanded and quantity supplied are the same at a price or a wage of 8, where Q star 8 workers, firms will rent out your labor, will hire 8 of you, while 8 of you will be willing and able to work for that price. So what do we see as far as consumer and producer surplus? We see consumer and producer surplus, consumer surplus. In this case, the way we're modeling it would be going to the firm who is hiring you, and producer surplus, you're the ones offering labor and producing goods and services with it, and your capital that you are developing in this class because you're awesome. They are this triangle. And we've got all the total surplus we can. So an efficient market for labor. Now let's go in and say that if we prop up prices, we're going to make people better off. This is always the argument here, right? We need to protect workers against low wages. So let's prop those up with a price floor, a minimum wage. I'll call it price P sub floor. And let's set it at a price of 9. Now, if this is a competitive market, lots of buyers and sellers transacting, if we put this price floor in place, call it price floor all the way across, right? Prices cannot fall below this floor. What do we see happening? If we put in this price floor of 9, we drive a wedge between quantity demanded and quantity supplied. And what do we see? We see, I'll call it QS high. We've got quantity supplied higher than quantity demanded. And I've got quantity demanded, that's low. Only four firms are going to be willing and able to hire. Or the firm is only going to want 4 workers, depending on how we're talking about this. So what do we see happening? We see a lot of you on the supply curve saying, yeah, $9, I'm in. Whereas the people who are renting your labor are saying, well, at that wage, we can only afford 4. It's not worth it. It's not worth it. So what do we generate? For you, workers, we create some deadweight loss here, because when only 4 people are going to be employed, we get a large swath of unemployment. So if there's a competitive market for labor, some workers here from 4 to 8 who used to have a job now won't. It creates unemployment, it is said. Well, that also creates deadweight loss for the firm who is renting your labor. Right? We have this area of mutually beneficial transactions, and it's now gone. Now, the firm who is doing the hiring, their consumer surplus is now going to be relegated to this small triangle, because that's the area above price and below demand. What about workers who do stay employed, though? If you do keep your job, or you do find a job where this price floor is in place, you are a winner. You are made better off. What happens? This rectangle of consumer surplus is now yours. So if you're one of these first 4 workers who does get a job, you were making $8 before, and now you make $9. So each one of you gets an additional $1 of producer surplus. That is commandeered away from consumer surplus. So you're made better off at the expense of the firm. What does this do to society? Well, the firms, the hirers, are made unambiguously worse off. They lose deadweight loss, and they lose this area to workers. The workers, though, some of you are winners. Some of you get this area that was consumer surplus. But there's also a lot of workers who are making up a surplus. A lot of people will be saying, I'd like a job, and unable to find one, because quantity supplied exceeds quantity demanded. So when people make an argument against the minimum wage or against an increase in the minimum wage, this is the model that's operating behind those assumptions. Now, in this model, we are arguing that the labor market is competitive, meaning, right, perfect information, free ease of entry and exit, many, many buyers, and many, many sellers. Well, does every labor market meet the competitive criteria? Do some? Sure. Do others? Of course not. Context matters. Just like there's all kinds of markets in the world, competitive, monopolistically competitive, oligopolistic, and monopolistic, there are types of labor markets. Some are fairly competitive. And if you institute a minimum wage, you will create deadweight loss and make society worse off. But there are labor markets where there's lots of sellers of labor, but a small number, either a few or one, buyers or renters of labor. If there's only one buyer, we call that a monopsony. And if there's only a few buyers, we call it an oligopsony. This is just the converse of when we have one seller being a monopoly and a few sellers being an oligopoly. So let's look at what a labor market that is a monopsony or an oligopsony, have the same effect. What would the ramifications be of a minimum wage there? And so it's important, if you're going to go out and look for a job, what wages look like. And it's also important as a member of society when many, many people are, again, really, really active against the minimum wage and really, really active for a minimum wage or a drastically increased minimum wage. That what matters is context. It matters what each particular market is. Does that make it more difficult to understand and analyze? Sure, of course. One answer for all problems is easier, but one tool doesn't solve all problems. No one said doing science was going to be easy or convenient. So let's look at, just for context, a monopsony labor market. With a price floor, a minimum wage. Let's check this out. All right, so to begin, we're going to have downward sloping demand, and like I said, we're going to call this marginal revenue product. When we modeled monopoly before, we had supply equal to marginal cost. This is why when instead of having one seller, we have one buyer, demand is marginal revenue product. We've got, when we hire each additional worker at the firm, we're doing so because of what they contribute to our marginal revenue. What do they do? What is our additional product we get? Okay, so let's draw a supply curve of all of you workers. Now, the interesting thing about a monopsony is that instead of setting supply equal to demand, they have an interesting wrinkle. With monopoly, we had demand with marginal revenue downward sloping and below it due to the output and income effects. Here we have a supply curve with a marginal cost curve above it. I'll draw that and label that MC for marginal cost. Let's make that much bigger. Got MC for marginal cost. Marginal cost is upward sloping and above supply because when the firm wants to hire an additional worker, now they have to induce more workers to work by increasing the wage. And so their cost, when they offer that higher wage, they now have to offer that higher wage to all the previous workers who would have worked for a lower price. So that drags up marginal cost above supply for the same reasons, the analog reasons just flipped, of why marginal revenue is downward sloping and below demand. And so when a firm optimizes, right, when they're going to make an optimal hiring decision, what are they going to do? They're going to set, yes, marginal revenue equals to marginal cost. They will find where marginal revenue product equals marginal cost, and they will hire that number of workers. Now, what wage will they offer? Will they offer this high wage? No, they will go down to the supply curve because that is the price that induces that many workers in order to work. That's the wage they would take. So you go down to the supply curve this time and hang a left. So this is our price monopsony. Right, this is the wage if there is a small number of people buying labor compared to the number of people trying to work. So what does this do? Do we get an efficient market outcome? We don't. What we have is, just off the get-go, deadweight loss. If there's a monopsony or an oligopsony, we have an inefficiently low number of workers working at an inefficiently low wage. This is great for the monopsonist or the oligopsonist. So this is, if you're them, perfect. This is great. But for society, what this does is generate a deadweight loss. So what we're getting at already is in a competitive market for labor, the market sets an efficient wage, and meddling with it, setting a price floor, will just muck things up and create deadweight loss. It will make society worse off. But if we have a inefficient market structure, one where power is vested in a small number of hands or only one, labor will be low and the wage will be low. Now, what we can do simply is impose a price floor where supply equals demand, right? That is an efficient outcome. And what that will do is induce the firm to hire we'll call it Q floor to be consistent, but this is a type of efficient regulation. By setting supply equal demand, the firm will demand an efficient amount of workers who have to be paid at price P floor. In order to have that price, they need to hire more workers to get the goods sold, get those out the door. So what do we see? Right? In our first outcome, we had deadweight loss. What was our consumer surplus? It was a big area that was going to the firm. While producer surplus, that is, you as a worker were just getting this small triangle. That's the before. But now that the price floor is in place, what happens? I'll take a guess. Workers now get back this area that was with the monopsonist, and additionally, get some area that was deadweight loss. This deadweight loss is eliminated and becomes producer surplus and consumer's surplus when the firm hires more workers and gets that area. So this is an efficient outcome through policy. So the conclusion here is that policy can make things worse and policy can make things better, and it's context dependent. One black and white answer does not serve an infinitely complicated reality. Markets take different forms. Theoretically, the firm could be forced to offer a price up to this level and would not reduce employment further. But if I were the consultant or the regulator, setting supply equals demand will reduce deadweight loss and make society a better place. So, are minimum wages bad? It depends. Competitive market, yes. Monopsony or oligopsony, no. It depends on, are there lots and lots and lots of people all buying and selling? Or are there a whole lot of us applying for a job where there's a small number of firms hiring who have power? There are plenty of markets where that's true. So again, context matters. Okay, so now that we've seen the theory and an example of a price floor, what does this mean for society? So we get deadweight loss. We lose mutually beneficial transactions. We get inefficiently low quantity. Too few units are transacted than what we could have had in a competitive outcome. We get inefficient allocation to sellers. So like with our minimum wage, people who maybe were willing and able to work more eagerly aren't able to find jobs, while people who are like, whatever, get induced to participate. So those who are most eager to be sellers in the market might not be given the opportunity to sell. There are wasted resources. Like when governments in developed countries have put price floors in place with agriculture, a lot of stuff has been produced that's just been thrown away, cheese, produce, and so on, that it sits and goes bad because the price is artificially high and nobody buys it. An interesting consequence is inefficiently high quality. When you can't compete on price, you have to compete on some other metric. So, for instance, when there were price floors in the airline industry, the firms competed on quality, right? Having comfortable seats and chef-designed meals and cocktails. It was a good experience to fly. People were, a jacket and a tie. But what did people really want? They wanted, Southwest $49 to Tucson. They wanted to have something that was price competitive. So when those policies went away and firms could compete on price, quality, it looks real different now, right? As everybody probably just flew home in their pajamas and sitting next to somebody with their bare feet out. Anyway, and this also generates black markets, right? If you are someone in a competitive market where there's a minimum wage and you get unemployed, you might work under the table. You might do anything you can to find work. You might do something illegal with, again, the not upstanding members of society. So, again, how can price floors be instituted and then persist? Again, people who benefit are influential. If you're getting, an agricultural price floor or a minimum wage price floor, you are winning. You're not going to let that go. You'll band together and you will fight. And I like to say there can be good intentions here too. Never underestimate good intentions in economic ignorance. So I'm not saying everybody is trying to hurt each other. I'm saying people are out for their self-interest. They're going to try and do things that benefit them. And sometimes policymakers just don't know better. So it's really good to be a competent and intelligent and well-educated member of society who knows what's efficient and what's not. So let's talk quotas. I'm sure that's what you wanted to do today. It's what I wanted to do, and it's why we're here. Awesome. A quota is, instead of meddling on our y-axis, we meddle on our x-axis where quantity lives. This is when a government or regulatory authority places a lower limit, a bound on quantity. Just like the price floor, these are intended to prop up the prices and protect firms against low prices. So the quota has to be below equilibrium quantity for it to be binding. If you put a quota in place above the equilibrium quantity, it would do nothing. We would just be at equilibrium. When we are going to deal with quotas, we're going to talk about the quota limit. The quota limit is the total amount that the good that can be produced and transacted under the quantity control. So this is the total amount of the good produced that is going to have to be less than equilibrium quantity. In order to hit the quota limit, firms are given licenses. And so a firm is given its share of the quota limit. Each firm is told how much stuff it can make, and it can't go above that amount. Some firms, in practice could get a bunch in their license, and some get a little bit, or it could be spread out evenly. It's going to depend on the situation. So what we'll do now is set up a graphical example to demonstrate what happens. Again, I'm going to put a perfectly competitive market on the left and then a quota on the right to drive a wedge between supply and demand to show that this also creates deadweight loss. We are going to get a reduction in total surplus when we meddle with a competitive market, if that's not becoming clear yet or not. And we will show you what happens to consumer and producer surplus here. Consumers are going to be made unambiguously worse off here. Producers, some will be worse off, some will be made better off. But society will be hurt because total surplus goes down as deadweight loss is generated. Let's get this set up. All right, so again, we're going to have the competitive market on the left and the quota on the right. Awesome. So, can't do this enough times. Let's have our demand curve going down and our supply curve going up. Every time you draw it, the world becomes a slightly better place. That's important in these confusing times. So if our market's in equilibrium, we know we've got price and quantity and consumer and producer surplus as big as possible. CS plus PS is TS, our total surplus, no deadweight loss, an efficient market. Okay, now what we're going to do is we're going to take this competitive market and institute a quota. So, let's draw that. Make that supply curve a little darker for you. That's better. So we're replicating the graph on the left. There's E for equilibrium, price, and quantity. Okay? So where we once, as we said, had our quantity at equilibrium, our price equilibrium, our consumer surplus, and our producer surplus all as big as possible, we are now going to meddle with the market by instituting quota. So we know our P and our Q, these were efficient, CS and PS were maximized, but now I'm a regulator, and I say, I really can't allow this equilibrium price to persist. What we need is to prop that up. Let's use a quota. So let's state some Q, I'll call it Q subscript quota. That seems creative. What does the quota do? This is the quota limit. This is the maximum amount of stuff that is allowed to be produced. In order to get there, we give all the firms that are allowed to produce a license that tells them the amount of stuff they each get to make that totally sums up to Q quota. Well, this is a mechanism designed to generate deadweight loss. We are hacking off the market just straight up. Those price controls, at least maybe somebody didn't know how things work. Here you're saying, we don't like this much stuff being generated. We want to create a world where there is deadweight loss. Let's just take out some producer surplus and consumer surplus right away. Well, why? What are we doing when we hack off the market here? We're restricting to high-priced consumers, people with a high willingness and ability to pay. So when we go from the quota and look at that, we see what is going on here. This is, I'll call it P demand in the quota. As this is a high price. We are saying we want less stuff to be generated and a higher price to be paid in the process. And what do we get here? At least conceptually here, we are going to limit the willingness to accept here. The price that firms could take is much less than what we're going to get consumers to pay. This is called a quota wedge, where we drive a gap between the price that actually gets charged in the market, and a low cost, a low willingness to accept on behalf of firms, right? It could be firms with, in practice, higher costs, anywhere up to this point along the supply curve, and those firms would be doing just fine because they get to charge this high price. But at least conceptually, what do we have happening? Low-cost suppliers getting a lot of money back. So what do we get? My producer surplus is all the area above supply and below the price. Because this is the price, firms are giving up some deadweight loss in exchange to get this rectangle. So in practice, you'd hope that this rectangle is a whole lot bigger than this triangle, because then at least somebody's being made better off by this policy. But again, society is worse off because of this deadweight loss. Now what about consumers? The consumers of this product are relegated to this little triangle, below demand and above the price. So consumers are unambiguously hurt by this policy. So what do we have here? We have some firms with a low cost being able to charge a small number of consumers a very high price. And so those firms steal away this area of consumer surplus and make it produce a surplus for themselves. Okay? How's that look? So good. Okay. Next, we're going to do a specific example of a quota. And to frame it, I'll say the Texas Railroad Commission places a quota on oil production. We'll use some simple fictional numbers for this, but it's based on a real example in the early, late 1920s, I think. The Texas Railroad Commission, yeah, it was late 20s. The Texas, we'll call them the Texas Oilmen. That's probably not the best term, but that's what they were called. They invested in oil production and brought a lot of supply online, and supply shifted up a lot, prices went down, and they were very frustrated with the low prices they were getting for oil as a result of their own investments. So they lobbied Congress, and the senators from Texas and Oklahoma gave the Texas Railroad Commission authority to institute a quota system to protect these oil producers basically from themselves and the investment they made. So let's look at that example. I'll set up the table and our supply and demand model now. Take a look at your phone. Okay, so I've set up a simple example here where our prices for gas can go from, for barrels of oil rather, will go from $4 to $7.50 increments. And then we'll have millions of barrels from 0 to 6 million barrels for our demand schedule and our supply schedule. And I've set up an example where we're going from 0 to 6 million barrels of oil, and our prices, of course, will jump to make it simpler, starting at 4, going up to 7 by 50-cent increments. So let's plot our supply and demand, look at what this would look like efficiently, and then let's institute a quota and see what happens. See what happens to consumer produced surplus. See how total surplus is reduced and calculate the deadweight loss that emerges. So at a price of 7, our coin demanded is 0. That's $6.50. It's 1. That's 6. It's 2. At $5.50, it's 3. At 5, it's 4. At $4.50, it's 5. At 4, it's 6 million. So let's plots demands and connect the dots. Label that with big D for demand. Now let's plot supply. So we'll work from the bottom to the top at a price of 4. Suppliers produce nothing, are willing and able to sell nothing. As the price goes up, law of supply kicks in. Price 450, we make 1. At 5, we make 2 millions of barrels. At 550, we make 3. At 6, we make 4. At 650, we make 5. At 7, we make 6. So let's connect the dots for supply. Label that with a big S for supply. Okay? Cool, cool, cool. So, as we can see, in equilibrium, what is going to happen? Well, quantity demanded and quantity supplied equal where? The price of 550 we have equilibrium where consumers and producers transact $3 million barrels. All right. Well, let's say the producers, the Texas oil men or whatever, come in and say, this price is unacceptable. We're making too much. Help us out. So let's say the senators give authority to the Texas Railroad Commission to institute a quota system where a quota limit, let's say, is 1 million barrels instead. So I'll call that Q subscript quota for Q quota limit. You can write limit there too if you want to. But what does this do? This immediately tells us how much stuff will not be transacted. That is, we are immediately taking some consumer and producer surplus away. When we had a competitive market, what did we have? We had this beautiful big consumer and producer surplus, right? The area below demand and above price for consumer surplus, and below price and above supply for producer surplus. Well, what happened? After the quota, consumers of oil now face fewer transactions, deadweight loss emerges, as well as some sellers. Mutually beneficial transactions to society now go away. Well, what do we have going on? What is the quota wedge? What will consumers actually pay? If we only enable a quota of 1 million, you can see that our quota wedge will be going from 450 to 650. So I'll call that price demand. This is how much consumers will actually now pay. So consumer surplus is going to be relegated to the smaller triangle below demand and above price. Now the winners of this policy are the firms who get to produce up to 1 million units. Why? Because producer surplus is above supply and below price. So firms get to keep this area, and this area that was consumer surplus now becomes producer surplus. And if we're limiting this to the low cost producers, what we've really got is a wedge from 450 to 650. So just to be clear, this is also producer surplus. What is my deadweight loss? Well, it is again the area of a triangle of missed mutually beneficial transactions. What is actually happening to society is 1/2 times 3 million minus 1 million lost transactions. 3 million minus 1 million lost transactions. And 650 minus 450, the quota wedge. So, what do we have? We have 1/2 times 2 million times $2. So, what do we get? 1/2 times 2 is 1 times 1 million times $2 is $2 million. And missed mutually beneficial transactions. So we've reduced total surplus by an area of $2 million lost mutually beneficial transactions. So what happens here? Consumer surplus is unambiguously reduced. Right? Consumers have lost both some area to deadweight loss, transactions that just poof disappear into the ether when we cut off the market with the quota, and they've also lost some area that has been again transferred to producer surplus. Some firms are worse off. If you don't get a license or you get basically run out of the market, you get deadweight loss. Some firms who were producing are not going to be able to, or firms who are producing what they wanted to will now be forced to produce less. That is, people will be run out on a rail from the transactions they wanted to be participating in. But if you do get the license that you want, some firms are made better off. Some firms are able to charge a higher price and grab some consumer surplus and make it producer surplus of their own. Okay. So what are the consequences for all of society by quotas? Quotas. Quotas. Sorry. Again, we get deadweight loss and inefficiently low quantity. All of these have this in common. This generates wasted resources in black markets as well. When a good doesn't exist and people previously had it and people want it, or people are now forced to pay an inefficiently high price for it, people will combat it and find other ways to operate. Black markets, man. If the good doesn't exist in legal means, people will find other ways to get it. And if there's inefficiently low quantity and it's something that people want, right? In New York City, there were medallions for taxi cabs that artificially restricted the quantity that could be transacted. What pops out of the sidewalk then? What grows where this inefficient market system or market manipulation is put in place? Things like Uber, Lyft, ride sharing. People wanted rides. They were tired of wasting their resources. someone filled in the gaps with a very clever way to combat an inefficiently low quantity and dead weight loss that was protecting a small number of producers of rides. So how can quotas be instituted and then remain in perpetuity? Well, sometimes war and famine put these in place. Sometimes well-intended politicians or regulators will restrict what people can consume for what might sound like an altruistic cause. We've got to put these things towards this other effort. And so a quota gets put in place that way. More typically, we see people who benefit from the quota being politically influential and bound together and ready to defend their welfare, while people who are being hurt by the policy may not have political sway, or even they might just be ignorant that they're being harmed by the policy. So again, never underestimate good intentions and economic ignorance. So in this lecture, we basically demonstrated that when markets are operating in a more or less competitive fashion, getting involved in them only creates dead weight loss, only generates inefficiency. So when we're talking about policy, a very important first step we made is to see that if a market works, leave it alone. It's doing the best that we can possibly get out of it, as we've showed when we defined perfect competition and developed the idea of total surplus. There's no better way to generate productive activity in society than a competitive market. Now, again, there are exceptions in the world, and we're about to look at them, right? We're going to look at externalities, public goods, common pool goods, and artificially scarce goods. These things are market failures. These are situations in which the market mechanism does not generate an efficient outcome. And so our mission as economists for the good of society is to look at this and to figure out how do we get markets that don't work in a competitive way to behave as if they are competitive markets or closer to competitive markets and get a more efficient outcome. So going forward, that's what we'll do. I hope you've enjoyed this. I've had a lovely time. Have a great day.